If my Silent Hill 2 video, which you should totally go watch by the way, was a carefully crafted love letter to that game, this video is going to be the 2 a.m. drunk text to an ex I haven't talked to in 13 years. We had what felt like a once-in-a-lifetime experience, loved our time together, and then drifted apart. But no matter where I look, I see them in everything. So on October 27th, as I slumped in my booth at the local dive bar, the imitation leather emblazoned with cracks and the unmistakable smell of cigarette smoke in the air, I pulled out my phone and messaged a contact whose last delivered timestamp read over a decade ago. Confusing and ultimately pointless analogies aside, Alan Wake 2 released recently after an incredibly long absence in the gaming space, and I couldn't be happier. I've had such an amazing time diving back into Cauldron Lake and have no qualms about calling Alan Wake 2 my game of the year for 2023. Yes, I'm genuinely placing this game on the top of my list, higher than Spider-Man 2, Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, Armored Core 6, Baldur's Gate 3, and so many other truly fantastic titles that have been released over the current year. Alan Wake 2 has easily won out for me, and if you stick around until the end of the video, I'll explain exactly why that is. As a fair warning, this video is going to be full of spoilers, and you should definitely already have an understanding of the first game, whether that's by playing it or watching an Alan Wake Story Explained video here on YouTube. With that being said, it's time for me to ramble about why I love Alan Wake 2 so much, with a point later in the video that'll be a pretty big shock to horror game fans. Horror can be a really subjective thing. What scares one person might not scare another, but the horror on display in Alan Wake 2 is the kind that clicked with me instantly. Remedy knows horror way more than I think I ever expected them to. Don't get me wrong, the original Alan Wake had some scary moments, but I was never on the edge of my seat for entire chapters like I was here in the sequel. First, I want to talk about a few of the technical elements of the game that really add to the atmosphere and build up that sense of dread in players, and then I'll take a look at the two main types of horror being used in the game. First, there's no way that I would have been as scared in this game as I was if the graphics didn't look as incredible as they do. Everything you see on screen, from character models to the environments and the sheer number of physics objects that litter your path, to the weather effects and especially the lighting, everything in this game looks stellar and works in tandem to create an entirely believable reality that sucks you in from the moment you lay eyes on it. When I'm wandering through the woods near Cauldron Lake late at night with only my flashlight to guide me, branches swinging in the wind near a flickering street lamp, causing shadows to dance across the rocky path I'm on, only for an axe to fly through the air, missing my head by mere inches, it's difficult to be anything other than terrified. I wouldn't be nearly as engaged with a scene like that if the graphics weren't up to par, but the lighting is probably the one key thing out of all of that. The concept of light forms the basis for both the driving force in the story and the main way to defend yourself in the gameplay. I can't offer you nearly as much information as Digital Foundry, but I was lucky enough to be able to play Alan Wake 2 on PC with ray tracing cranked up to the highest setting, and it was bordering on unreal. It genuinely does so much for the overall presentation and aids in making moments like the one I described by Cauldron Lake that much scarier. Sound is also used to great effect, and I have two main examples to bring up for this. First, there are the enemies present in the Dark Place during Alan's chapters of the game. These shadowy figures are constantly whispering things at the player, and as they group up and advance on your position, these whispers grow louder and begin to overlap, overwhelming your sense of sound and contributing to a feeling of panic. Outside of the Dark Place, playing as Saga, there are numerous occasions where sound is used to build tension. With so many little audio cues playing throughout the environment, it feels as if the levels themselves are an old house creaking in the wind as it settles. My favorite use of these audio cues is during the level Return 5 Old Gods, in which Saga has to investigate the Valhalla nursing home and meet with the band the Old Gods of Asgard, who she's also related to. There's a section of gameplay during this level where the player has to explore the flooded basement of the nursing home to find an electrical fuse and replace a dead one. The sound design here is utterly perfect, with noises bouncing off the walls and across the surface of the water that had me constantly checking my corners and turning around to see if there were enemies about to attack. This build-up culminated in a moment where I had to put the controller down and remember to breathe. As when you go to interact with a note on the wall towards the back of the basement, locking your point of view on the page to read it, you hear something move in the water directly behind you. As the player, you have to provide input to back out of the note, forcing you to engage with whatever scare you're anticipating. So you do it, and you turn around, the music still swelling, to reveal nothing. If there was ever a horror game to play with headphones, Alan Wake 2 would be it. I can't stress enough how well designed and executed all of the auditory horror in this game is. Speaking of audio, let me tell you about the sponsor of today's video, TZ Audio. The lovely folks over at TZ Audio sent me their Stellar X3 condenser microphone, which you've been hearing for this entire video. This is an XLR microphone that uses a carefully hand-tuned K67 capsule to provide you with the best sound possible. In addition to that, the Stellar X3 includes a newly designed springless shock mount that reduces vibrations more effectively than other mounts on the market and eliminates the risk of it resonating in your recordings. If you're in the market for an incredibly high quality microphone for live streaming, making YouTube videos, recording music, or even playing games online, be sure to check out the link in the description and in the pinned comment below. And remember, if you like what you've heard from the microphone throughout this video, be sure to let me know by leaving a comment. Thank you to TZ Audio for the sponsorship, and now back to the video. With the more technical aspects of the horror out of the way, I also want to touch on how Alan Wake 2 expertly blends two subgenres of horror, these being survival horror and psychological horror. I've defined what survival horror is to me in my Silent Hill 2 video. Again, please go watch that after you finish this video. But if you haven't seen it yet, let me briefly recap here. Horror games need to have a few different elements to be defined as survival horror, those being exploration, combat, puzzle solving, and resource management. Both Alan and Saga's chapters include all of these elements, with each of them handling things in a slightly different way. Alan explores the Dark Place, which has been modeled after a fictional version of New York City he created for his Alex Casey book series, whereas Saga explores Bright Falls and the surrounding areas. The combat across both characters' chapters is phenomenal. Playing on the normal difficulty, I never faced more than 2 to 3 enemies in most encounters, but would still feel the pain of every missed shot due to the very carefully balanced distribution of resources to scavenge for, which needs to be properly organized in your inventory, and the amount of flashlight charges and ammunition it costs to kill one single taken enemy. Enemies hit hard, and it's the kind of system I had to adjust to moving from the first game into the sequel. But this new approach is much better suited for the survival horror design it's shooting for. Lastly, there are the puzzles, which are much more prevalent in Alan's chapters, though Saga still has some to solve. Alan's puzzles were definitely my favorite though, as you'll need to use his storyboard to rewrite parts of the world around you in the Dark Place to keep moving forward. Many of these scenarios have you mixing and matching the different story elements that Alan comes up with, and on multiple occasions I had to think things through for a few minutes before figuring out the right combination and placing myself at the right parts of the level. All of these elements combined to make Alan Wake 2 a superb survival horror title, but Remedy wasn't done just yet. In terms of psychological horror, Alan Wake 2 delivers in spades. I already touched on it a little bit when discussing the auditory horror elements, but Return 5 Old Gods really is the best showcase of Remedy's work with psychological horror. On a narrative level, seeing Cynthia Weaver from the first game, this borderline incorruptible Lady of Light who fought the Taken alongside Alan, finally get possessed by the darkness in the nursing home, is terrifying. It shows just how much more powerful the darkness is becoming, to have toppled a character we once knew as its very antithesis, and also serves to make players feel like they're now prey in Cynthia's hunting grounds. From the moment she reveals herself as a Taken, which quite literally made me scream out loud, to the moment we fight her as a boss in the overlap, I never felt safe for even a second. Speaking of the overlaps, where the Dark Place and the real world cross over, the one in this level in particular plays with the concept of looping hallways, false dead ends, slight changes to rooms, and much more. These were really well crafted, leaving me feeling more uneasy on each new loop, and honestly, the closest approximation I can make to another game that I've played would be PT, the Silent Hills teaser. And I mean that as the highest possible compliment. Not only that, but these repeating hallways and small visual changes in the gameplay segments help drive home Alan Wake 2's narrative themes of looping stories as well. Speaking of the story, let's jump into that now. I can't possibly explain the intricacies of Alan Wake 2's story in a cohesive way without keeping you here for hours. So instead, I'd just like to talk about some of my favorite narrative beats and plot points, and how Remedy has nailed the pacing and structure of major reveals, while still keeping you on your toes until credits roll. Before I get too deep into the rest of the points I want to make about the story, I just want to address the use of the Federal Bureau of Control in the game. After playing Control's Alan Wake DLC, and seeing references to the FBC early on in Alan Wake 2, I was really worried that Remedy might have them step in and quote-unquote save the day, or that they would focus too heavily on the connected universe that these series share. While not an unwarranted concern, I'm very happy to say that Alan Wake 2 is still an Alan Wake-centric game. The FBC is involved in the main plot, but they are exclusively relegated to the supporting cast. The main focus is still Alan and Saga for the entire game, and I think this was a fantastic decision by Remedy. It would have been all too easy for them to jump the gun and try to kickstart a sloppy crossover. But Remedy has put an immense amount of time and effort into crafting this world, and that level of care is upheld here throughout the entire experience. The FBC's inclusion actually adds to the story in a really unique way. They're trying to study the properties of Cauldron Lake and how the dark power affects fiction, so they set up nursery rhyme puzzles across the world that the player can solve. These reward the player with extra charms for Saga's bracelet, providing gameplay buffs, while also giving players a better understanding of how the Dark Place affects the town of Bright Falls and the rest of the world by extension. It's a fantastic teaching tool for anyone jumping into these games for the first time, or for those who may have forgotten a thing or two since their last trip to the Pacific Northwest in 2010. Another few pieces of the game that aid in the overall storytelling are the manuscript pages and Saga's Mind Place. The manuscript pages are a holdover from the original game and function very similarly. You'll find these pages scattered across the game, and you can pick them up to read from the manuscript of Return that Alan has written. Practically none of these are required reading for story progression, with very few instances reading excerpts out loud to the player without their express input. But for those interested in getting as much story content as possible from this game, these add so much to the experience. And the writing itself is sublime. They truly feel ripped right off the page of a real horror novel, while also incentivizing further exploration of the levels. However, Saga's Mind Place is a new addition to this entry in the series, one that I particularly enjoyed. Saga is a detective for the FBI and has the ability to enter her mind place and piece together clues from the story on a case board. This is a fantastic way to get players engaged with the story, allowing them to look at all the different pieces of the puzzle laid out right in front of them at any point. This was a really useful feature when I was trying to make sense of the story as I moved through it for the first time, forcing me to think critically and place the clues where they actually made sense. Completing cases gives further explanation of the story from Saga, but the act of interacting with these clues ourselves and placing them on the board makes players feel like their input mattered in progressing the story. A really nice final touch on this feature is that it won't slow down players on repeat playthroughs. As you rarely need to place clues on the board to move the story along, it's all there to benefit the player's understanding rather than restrict them. And anything that Saga finds out through the natural process of playing the game will be automatically pinned to the board the next time you enter the Mind Place. Now let's dig into the really fun stuff. The way the narrative is framed in the initiation chapters of the game gives players a glimpse into Alice's life after escaping from the Dark Place at the end of the first game. She's seeing what she believes to be visions of Alan, but that Alan believes to be the Dark Place personified as Mr. Scratch. He's convinced that Scratch is tormenting Alice, leading her to become paranoid, reclusive, and depressed. She was always a photographer, and decides to turn these experiences into an exhibit titled The Dark Place. As we revisit our apartment near the end of the initiation chapters, we see Alice testing things out to prepare for this exhibit, in which she includes video diaries of her experiences as time goes on. In these recordings, she talks about Alan, not Scratch, always having anger inside of him and how this is all becoming too much for her to handle. Ultimately, Alice takes her own life, documenting the very act with photographs to be included as the final piece of her exhibit. After watching all of this play out, I was so convinced that we would see Remedy pull back the curtain to reveal that this was all some story that Alan had conjured up for another book, that the Dark Place as we the players knew it was never real, that he was actually just an abusive husband that would lash out during stints of writer's block, an exaggerated version of what we saw in the first game's opening as Alice presented him with the gift of the typewriter. I was sure that Scratch was just an alter ego that Alan had come up with to separate the part of himself that drove Alice to her untimely end and wash his guilt away. I spent the last half of the game inching closer and closer to fully believing this. And then, in an after-credits scene, Remedy drops a bombshell. Alice is back on camera, recording one final video. She sits down, opening with the line, "This part is just for you," as though she's speaking directly to us, the players. Alice is back in the Dark Place. She willingly came back to save Alan, but to do so she needed to put on that exhibition. to lead him to where he needed to be to write himself and everyone else safely to the end of this story. The act of her coming back to the dark place perfectly mirrors Alan's own dive back in during Deerfest, showing just how far both of them are willing to go to see this through. Whether this is resolved in DLC coming down the line for Alan Wake 2, or in a full-fledged Alan Wake 3, it was an incredible reveal that floored me, given how convincingly they had sold the idea that Alice was dead. I know passion is a bit of a unique category to have in a game review style video, but this is still my own 2 AM drunk text to this game, so we're just gonna roll with it. Passion isn't exactly something you can quantify, but there's very few developers out there who put as much of their own DNA into their games as Remedy does. There are so many references to their previous work, both big and small, with some characters asking Alan directly to his face what "it's not a lake, it's an ocean" means, calling out the fact that fans have waited years for an answer. Sam Lake reprises his role as the visual design of Alex Casey, one of Alan's characters from his books, who is a direct callback to Max Payne, and they even brought James McCaffrey back to voice him. There is such reverence for their previous work on display here, but it never feels forced, and there's always something new being done with these ideas, so it doesn't feel like Remedy is resting on their laurels. So here's the point in the video I referenced earlier. The one that came as a huge surprise to myself, as I'm sure it will for many other horror game fans. There is a full-blown, 20-minute long, rock opera musical sequence in this horror game. And it is hands down one of my favorite levels in any video game ever. Titled Initiation 4, We Sing, this level is placed about halfway through Alan's journey across the dark place, and features Alan exploring Warlin Door's TV studio while the old gods of Asgard perform a song depicting the story of the entire series up to this point. The visual spectacle alone is unmatched by anything I've played before, rivaled only by Remedy's other works, with the set of the studio changing to accommodate the sections of the story that the song is describing. But this isn't just a fun walk through a cool-looking set piece. The game opens up at multiple points and has you fighting the Taken during guitar solos after handing you a flare gun in a brief moment of empowerment for the player. Everything about this sequence is beautifully done. There really isn't any other word to describe it. This is easily the highlight of the game for me, as I'm sure it is for many others, and I can't wait to see what other crazy ideas Remedy brings to fruition in the future. This chapter ends with a full-blown live-action dance number from the cast. And watching the creative director Sam Lake right up there on stage with all the other actors, seeing what an absolute blast everyone is having, it was impossible for me not to be having a fantastic time too. To cap things off, there's even going to be a New Game Plus mode added soon, possibly titled The Final Draft, and information from data mining suggests it could even include new story content that pushes the cyclical themes of the plot even further. With this much passion poured into Alan Wake 2, it is beyond evident that Remedy loves their games right alongside their fans, and they aren't afraid to show it. It's no secret that I love Remedy Entertainment. I've talked about their work on the channel before, and have always enjoyed their games. But Alan Wake 2 is something special. It's an absolute masterclass in both the survival and psychological horror genres. It's an incredibly compelling narrative continuation of the original title, while introducing further aspects of the shared Remedy universe, without it being overbearing. And it's the studio's celebration of their very own works, which shows how proud they are of what they've created over the years without being self-aggrandizing or too reliant on old material. Alan Wake 2 is not the game you should jump into this franchise with. It's not as easy as the original game was. It's become a real survival horror game by this point. It's not the easiest story to understand on your first playthrough, but it's more than worth putting in the effort to decipher. It's not your run-of-the-mill AAA game. There is such genuine love and passion poured into every pixel on screen. Alan Wake 2 isn't just a game. It's my game of the year. And it's not a loop. It's a spiral.
There is no one left to love, and there's no light left to guide us home. I keep you with me through the darkest nights, and I won't let go, won't let go. I lost Still got my voice, last words to say. I'll change this story so it's saying, when there's no one left to love.